Back into some kinship first, which is, I said in this chapter, there's going to be some connections, or could be some connections, between our kinship chapter, kinship, marriage, and family, and the coming of age chapter. And if you could look on page 168, sentence that both Francis and Taylor noted here, talking about kinship relationships, and there's a person who shows up there, the mentor of Malinowski, who we've heard about before, the person who wrote Argonauts of the Western Pacific, one of the first ethnographies ever. The mentor of Malinowski, one of his mentors was A.R. Radcliffe Brown, over there in the UK, very Brit, very Radcliffe Brown. And Radcliffe Brown is associated with, I think I told you maybe on the very first class, that over there in Britland, they did something more called social anthropology. So over here in the United States, we called it cultural anthropology because, I don't know, we're more in the realm of ideas and symbols, and they did it more in terms of social anthropology. Actually, King has a pretty good description of this. While Boas and his students were more likely to use the term culture to describe their main interest, their British counterparts tended to think in terms of systems and functions. So there it is, structure and function. And Radcliffe Brown and Malinowski are associated with a school of thought called structural functionalism, which is kind of like it sounds, that the structure of society is going to play an influence on the functions that happen. That's way oversimplifying what is probably a more complex idea. And so in some ways, it is perhaps the Brits who become more obsessed with the kinship charts than even the people in the cultural anthropologists in the United States, because they believe that the kinship chart and the lineage and descent thing would unlock the social keys to understanding how a society worked and how people felt toward each other, that you wouldn't have to worry too much as long as you knew where they were. So, let's see, British counterparts. Like I said, I think this is where we got two people to give us a quote. Some societies place child-rearing burdens on brothers-in-law rather than fathers. Actually, it may help if you look back at your own kinship chart that you did and try to think about who you were closer to on your parents' side, or people who you are closer to in this generation. So let's think about this for a second. So usually in our societies, we think about parenting as being done by the mother and the father, correct? So, but what they're saying here is that in some societies, place child-rearing burdens on brothers-in-law. Wait. Here. I guess, what kind of society might, oh, wait a second. This is what I want. Brothers-in-law. That's not going to happen. That's wrong. I'm usually going to put this, let me ask you a question. What kind of, I'm thinking about the maternal uncle. I guess the mother's brother, rather than the brother-in-law. Brothers-in-law, yeah, that might happen. I'm thinking about what kind of society would place emphasis on the kind of parental role of your mother's brother. Your mother's brother. What kind of society would do that? Where you would think of yourself, if you were the kid, you would think of yourself as more tied to your mother's brother, maybe than even to your own father. All right, Mickey, go ahead.
Is it a matrilineal?
A matrilineal society. right? So yeah, very nice. So it's like the person who's really important here, because everything's coming down the female line. So the person who's really important here is the mother's brother, because they're the ones who are going to have the family stuff and the inheritance. And so in matrilineal societies, often the father, I mean, it's not the fathers aren't important, but they're not such a big deal because the father has other responsibilities over here. When I think of brothers-in-law, that might be more of a patrilineal society in which brothers-in-law come in. I mean, this might be. Anyway, let's see. What else do they say? Others emphasized cross-cousin marriage, the practice of perpetuating particular clan relationships by ensuring unions between male and female offspring from different branches of one family tree. So we talked about this. Here you are being the person here, and you might be encouraged to marry your cross cousins, either on the matrilateral side, I guess that would be encouraged, or the patrilateral side, depending. Because your cross cousins really wouldn't be technically related to you, but they would be important parts of your life. Help you, yeah, right. In our terminology, all these are first cousins because we do not differentiate between mothers. We do not have a separate term for uncle. Uncle in our society means either mother's side or father's side. In other societies, you would never have the same term to delineate an uncle that could mean mother's side or father's side. That would be way too imprecise. I would lump two people together who might be completely different. You know what I'm saying? So we consider all of these to be first cousins. I mean, and if you're in a matrilineal or a strong matrilineal or a strong patrilineal society, they might be considered cousins, but they'd be a very different relationship. So it makes for some interesting ideas, and it did seem to explain some things about society that if you didn't understand the kinship system would seem nuts. So one of the really interesting examples that Radcliffe Brown gave is what he called the example of a joking relationship. So he gave an example of this society that was very prudish when it came to talking about sex and all those things. They wouldn't talk about it, very buttoned down, didn't care to talk about sex at all. Except he noticed when a particular young man was in the presence of a particular older woman, all of a sudden they'd be joking, pulling at each other, laughing. There was no sex involved, but it was very ribald. It was very jokey, let's say. And there was a lot of sex talk there. And it was only with one young man and a particular older woman, and then she would go off and they'd go back to being buttoned down again. What might you guess was the relationship between this young man and the older woman? Or if you look at your own kinship charts, even in our society, where are the sources of tension? Sometimes between one generation males and older generation females. Where could you guess? Most of you don't have one of these yet, but you might. You might acquire one. All right.
Money.
Huh?
Money?
No, no. We need a relationship. Yeah, we might not have money, but we're looking to acquire it. Yes, Flight Path is going to give you all the stuff. A mother-in-law relationship. One of the
Some of you might not have this yet. I don't think any of us do.
you might, you don't want to rule it out. You might have a mother-in-law. Who knows? That's not legal to ask. You can't just ask if anybody's married. There might be a few married people here. We don't want to count them out. The mother-in-law relationship, a source of tension in many societies, and in this society it wasn't. They diffused the tension by making a joking relationship, right? So it would be this place where it was like letting off steam. Now, of course, if you just observe this from the outside, it would look nuts, right? It's like, what's going on? But if you have that's why when people had these kinship charts, they thought they had the key that unlocked all of social relationships. So they got really into this, as we talked about in the last class. In some ways, it became a new form of determinism. That is to say, it seemed to lock people into social roles, and probably the Brits like to lock people into social roles, so they loved recording all this stuff. They got very obsessed about it, in part because that's what they did in their own society, right? They have all those, we just saw them doing the royal thing and lining up for hours to see somebody that's dead. Like, that's
No, that was real.
it's,
They all did that. Like, I'm not kidding. They all gathered. They all did that at the same time.
Is this for the king or
The new king.
Okay.
They all like
It's not they're celebrating King died.
No, not really. Yeah,
But
that's Ireland.
yeah, correct. That's Ireland.
the last class. I skipped over one of these. What is that, by the way? Huh? Well, there's siblings there. Here's some siblings, yes. This is a nuclear family, correct, yes. The nuclear family, right? And so this appears in Gonzalez on page 150 to 151. This is kind of seen as an ideal in the United States, right? You got your father, your mother, a sister, and a brother, 2.14 children. And, that's where the dog comes in. You got your dog and your nuclear family, and you're all happy. And Gonzalez says that she writes that the neo-local nuclear family makes sense in industrial societies where you might have to move around a lot and go to a different place to get a job, this neat family unit. And it works in terms of independence training. And the reason I was too sad to put this in at the last class is because it was getting too depressing. I mean, it gets sort of depressing when you think about what's happening to our families these days. And so the way I've phrased this, because oftentimes people want to defend this as the only good way to live, but there's been a lot of stress on the nuclear family. In fact, the majority of people in the United States in the current world do not live in nuclear families. It's no longer a majority the unit that people are living in. And so I talked in a couple classes ago when she brought up the idea of independence training, and I was kind of skeptical of it because it's very difficult to get that kind of independence. So we say we're training people for independence, but we're often extending their dependence by doing it that way. And then it's also getting very difficult to get a neo-local family, right? To get a separate house where you can get married into. That's why when Seth quizzed you all to see who was married, nobody raised their hand, because you have to have your own independent house to be married. And, that's part of the reason why people believe that the marriage rates have gone down, because it's difficult to establish your own house. It's difficult to get a house and buy one, and then to have this nuclear family. Now, a lot of people get upset about this. They call this the decline of the traditional family. traditional family has gone away. And there's, I mean, there's reasons to be concerned when people are having troubles like this. But the other thing that I would say is that this situation creates a lot of stress on just two people. And so when things go tough, it tends to be a fragile kind of unit, in the sense that so much emotional and economic energy and stress is placed upon a very narrow range of people. So it doesn't seem to be the most resilient form, in the sense of being adaptable to different economic situations. One could argue that the extended family, where you're having the input from multiple generations in a single household, is in some ways more flexible and resilient for different kinds of economic circumstances. And increasingly, it seems, or many people in the United States are kind of living in extended families now, perhaps for that very reason, because it's nice to have grandparents around to do childcare and to provide, or they're very close to having extended families, let's put it that way. Live very close to your parents or grandparents. And so the reason I'm talking about this is not because I want to say that we should all live in extended families or live in different kinds of monogamous or polygamous or serial monogamy relationships, but simply to say this is one of the huge points of the anthropology program, was to say, look, let's look at this society, let's look at this unit in comparison to other possibilities, in comparison to other ideas. And perhaps one of the most famous books, I think it may be the most famous book ever written by an anthropologist. I was trying to think if there's anything that would have sold more. I mean, certainly there have been some famous books, but this one is probably the most famous. And we don't maybe read it as much anymore. Maybe we never did, but it certainly over time, I think, has been the most famous, the most best-selling. I looked to see as you read about, some of these first covers had some racy, drawings of bare-breasted Polynesian women and stuff. So I resisted putting up that cover, because we don't want to sell our books based on that. But this book came out in 1928. It had a little bit of a racy cover at that time, and as King tells us, there was kind of a fascination with Polynesian societies, and people thought they were cool back in the day. And I think that in some ways, when we think of the title of this book and we think about our own ideas about what people in other societies, how they come of age, we're tempted to believe, or we're tempted to think that this is going to be a story about the poor, oppressed Samoan girl who is in a subordinate relationship and must get married. And there's Margaret Mead to go describe these poor girls to us. So, what do we find? Juliana, what do we find about those Samoan adolescents?
They were saying that their
adolescence is a period of freedom and possibility rather than stress. And Brady, what do we learn about those oppressed Samoan women? What are they up to?
They were, I talked about, they were, they got the same opportunities as the population, and succeeded roles that were usually assigned to males.
Yeah, that was on page 163 at the bottom. You didn't have to imagine a world in which females might succeed in tasks typically assigned to males. You just had to spend some time in a Samoan village where girls were accustomed to seeing their mothers and aunts take on public speaking roles and express their opinions in great assemblies. Remember, this is 1928. Barely been able to vote in this country. So what Mead would write in 1928 is that the stress is in our own civilization, that stress of growing up, of becoming an adolescent, of all the pangs. He said that in some ways it would be hard to identify who precisely the adolescents were in Samoan society. It was simply a kind of transition into a different form of life, but as Juliana put it, as a time of freedom and possibility, and we're not a big deal. The stress is in our own in our civilization. And so this would become, like I said, one of the big messages of anthropology back in 1928. I think that Mead wrote this in the same way in which your anthropology, intro to anthropology professor might express it in class. Realizing, back in the day, they wrote realizing with an S, realizing that our own ways are not humanly inevitable nor God ordained, but are the fruits of a long and turbulent history. So again, she's not saying that we go off and copy what the Samoans do. In fact, it's pretty clear that, we don't want to, as King puts it on top of page 166, the solution was not to make Americans into Samoans, of course, but rather to begin to see one's own logic and common sense as only a sampling of the many possible ways of shaping the social world. It's not like we're going to go copy what other people are doing. That's probably not a good idea, especially out of context, but to try and turn our attention to the ways in which our own ideas are a sampling of the things that are possible. So on the one hand, this is the way that anthropology is headed. Like I said, we're 100 years later, and this is probably something that I have said in an anthropology class. The things that the essence of cultural relativism is realizing that our own ways are not inevitable, divine, biologically given, but the fruits of a long and turbulent history. Not sure if I've used the word turbulent, but turbulent history. So that's the way that anthropology is going. The rest of the world is going in a slightly different direction. Nick, what's being talked about now at this time? What do we learn here?
Later this time, in 1905, a British biologist named William Bateson had invented a new word, genetics. So they started to look into genes and genetics, obviously. These were all created due to the increasing interest in the Mendelian inheritance and finding out genes and how traits and characteristics pass from parents to offspring.
Okay, so going into a little biology here, but people are becoming interested in Mendel. I mean, and just I guess this is going into my evolutionary history a little bit. If you remember, Charles Darwin comes up in the 1860s with this idea of natural selection. At a similar time, Gregory Mendel is working on his pea plants off in a monastery somewhere. They didn't know each other, and they both died without reading each other's work. And so the Darwinians didn't know anything about inheritance. And so, as Nick tells us, that interest in Mendelian genetics is coming out later. And the very term genetics is being invented and talked about at that time by this person named William Bateson. By the way, did that surprise you, Nick? That when I say genetics, who do you usually think of? Well, maybe we won't just draw on Nick. Who do we usually think of? Yeah. Huh? We certainly think about Mendel. Who else do we think of? Darwin, he didn't know about genetics. He's off there and the other thing. Who else do you see in your head? Well, let me put it to you this way. Huh? This is page 172. No one had ever seen a gene. The term genetics and genes precedes those Watson and Crick people and the whole DNA. When the DNA is discovered, the term gene, DNA gets discovered later, and then they say, aha, we found the genes. The idea of genes was around, or started to come around beforehand. Now, at a similar time, people are starting to develop the notion of IQ tests, a number that you can use to gauge people's intelligence. And they're starting to say, hey, maybe that comes through to us through Mendelian genetics as well. And they're starting to test people. That's where the SAT comes in. 1926, the first SAT is administered, and they basically think it's an IQ test. And one of the reasons they're trying to do this is to kind of make sure we're getting the best and the brightest into college, right? Because it was assumed that it was in your genetics that would bring this stuff out. Now, Mead and Boas are trying to tell us way before other people did that, hey, wait a second, right? It seems like these IQ tests and these SAT tests and stuff are more reflective of people's abilities in English, for one thing, if they were an immigrant population, and their cultural, social class understanding. Remember in the last class, I talked about how one of the things about the SAT test or the ACT or whatever test you take is it almost perfectly correlates to wealth, to social class. But at the time, this was seen as revealing the basis of IQ. And so, I mean, the basis of something genetic. And so while the rest of, while Boas and Mead are arguing for the idea of the cultural bias and that maybe it wasn't inherent in the test, and that the rest of the United States started doing some, if you didn't read 172 through 178, some pretty scary stuff about trying to figure out who's fit, who's unfit, and who should be involuntarily sterilized. And, at least half of the United States were passing laws about being able to sterilize people, especially women, laws that were on the books, and people were, talking about eugenic fitness and fitter families and making sure that the population was not given to imbecility. Oh, yikes. So that's what's going on. We have on the one side what we know from science, which is the social class and cultural bias of the test. But as far as what's going on in the real world, or in the world of the United States at the time, Boas and Mead are not actually winning this battle. And in fact, when it came to the very idea of crime, well, what were those criminologists looking for? What were they trying to find? Yeah, the genes that made you a criminal. Actually, earlier in this book, they talk about the cephalic index. Those mug shots where you have the head on and the sideways? Those were developed to try and figure out if somebody's head shape could predict whether they were going to be a criminal or not. That's why you go in and they're like turned to the side when you go in, when you get dragged in. So when you have to go in there. And so the criminologists were looking for the genetic origins of crime. And if you can sterilize a few criminals and keep them from passing along their genes, right? And what were the anthropologists up to? It's always more fun if you can find out the genetic origins of crime, because that would be very exciting. The anthropologists are always saying something much more complex. What does anthropology believe about crime? If I call you a criminal, what is that based on? Yeah.
Here might not be the time for this.
Yeah. I don't know. Hey, let's do polygamy, right? Criminal or idealized, right? So the same exact action, what counts as crime, there's those scare quotes that anthropologists love to use, crime is actually a cultural value. And what might be a criminal in one society might be something very cool in a different society. And especially how it's punished, as they say here, there's all sorts of white collar crime going on, financial crimes going on, but they don't get punished, they don't get sterilized. They get the good prisons anyway, if we ever get to them. What is that part about George Washington? Ah, yes, page 180, Boaz. Had the British managed to capture George Washington, their modern-day eugenicists would likely have developed a theory of the inherited deficiencies that made him so criminally rebellious. Right? He's always trying to rise up, and we got to sterilize that guy and make sure that he gets thrown in jail. Yeah. Well, yeah, for a while, until he turned criminally rebellious, we got to cut that guy off. So his genes finally came out.
No, but they finally showed the truth.
He didn't do the hip hip hooray anymore. When they said do the hip hip hooray, didn't like it. Why is this, Felicia? Why is it that what we come to know as crime is culturally determined? Babies know what crime is. Why not? Because we're born culturalists. So we have to be. This is on page 162. It's an old argument from Margaret Mead. Babies come into the world cultureless, she wrote. They know none of the rules of good behavior, what constitutes beauty or ugliness, how to be a proper person. Over the course of their lives, humans learn these things from the people around them. It's what we count as beautiful, ugly, all of those things. Now, on the one hand, Mead's book, as I said, would be a huge bestseller, have enormous, as you read it here, people really loved her, they loved to think about her, enormous social influence. It was really popular at the time. There's a book that came out titled Margaret Mead Made Me Gay, right? So, I mean, obviously this person was making a bit of a joke. He wasn't actually saying that Margaret Mead made her gay, but the idea was, right, that Margaret Mead opened up the possibilities of life. It said, hey, things are different. People in different societies do things differently, and what might be criminalized or psychologized in one society might be fine in another society. And so, hey, it's okay. So on the one hand, you do have this enormous social influence, this enormous kind of cachet, and she was very popular among many people, not just people who identified as gays, among many people. But in terms of the policies and the laws that were being enacted, as we just talked about, we were having involuntary sterilizations, we were having laws about criminality, and certainly being able to have same-sex marriage. That's something that the anthropologists might have been able to argue for from a long time ago, but it didn't happen until quite recent. So in terms of the policy influence, maybe not so much. I will also say that there has been a huge backlash to Margaret Mead and basically the ideas of anthropology in general. Now, you can imagine some of the backlash coming from people that say, aha, yes, Margaret Mead is making our kids gay. So bad anthropologists. My kid took an anthropology class and they came home polygamous, I mean, all this crazy talk, right? So on the one hand, there was kind of what you might call reactionary or conservative backlash, but there were other forms of backlash as well. So let me ask you this. For someone, if you identified as gay in American society, why might the idea that Margaret Mead made me gay, why might you not like that idea? Why might you have a backlash to that idea? Yeah. Well, but I'm talking about if I'm talking about the people who identify as gay. Yeah, so.
It's the whole idea of like,
right. You can't be made gay, right? I mean, no, the people who identified as gay didn't want to be it's very valuable in US society to be able to claim I was born this way, right? It's biological, damn it. I can't change it, because if you can, then, oh no, right? Then we're back in those camps where you re-educate people, right? You make them something, right? So again, this is a joke, right? And what she's saying is that Margaret Mead helps to open up those possibilities, but you can see that there might be a little bit of a backlash from what we might consider the left as well. And so it led me to wonder about this, which is, why do we in the United States, and I'm not sure if we love biological or genetic determinism more than other societies or not, but I know we love it. I know that we love the idea that we are biologically determined. I was trying to think about, why do we love it so much? Why do we love biological determinism, or that we have to explain? So this is what I was thinking. What is the United States society founded on? What is our ideal? What is, when we go into the Constitution and these things, what do we say we believe? Freedom, yes, I like freedom. Freedom and the pursuit of happiness, based upon what? Yes. Birthright citizenship. Yeah, we like to be citizens, and when we are born, we are created equal. Hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. All men and women and others are created equal. But here's the problem, right? If all people are created equal, and we look around us and we see a profoundly unequal society, how do we explain it, right? Do we criticize our society, or do we just say, must be that certain people are given to criminality, aren't capable of success, their IQs are not up to snuff, so they're not going to make enough money in the world. And so in some ways, and this is not my idea, but the profound inequality of the United States, which is not unlike, it's not that we have more inequality than other societies, but we are in a profoundly unequal society that nevertheless professes that all people are created equal. If we go back to the Brits, they don't believe that all people are created equal. It's like, it'd be absurd. It's like, no, people have their social class. That's where you're born. That if you're born into being a butler, that's what you should do. You might be a very smart butler, but they don't have to worry. They don't have to worry about genetic determinism to figure out their society. They're fine with social determinism. But in the United States, We have to believe there's something underlying it that because we're all equal, right?